Hello, welcome back to Bungacast, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm in São Paulo, Brazil. My name is still Alex Hochuli. Today I'm innocent and shameless. George Hoare in London. Where do you fit on the spectrum of guilty and innocent and shameful and shameless?
I kind of assumed I was innocent, but the fact that you're asking me that question makes me reconsider.
Makes you feel guilty.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think innocent until proven guilty. That's my position on this, and yeah, that still is. I also have not changed my name, so
Any feelings of shame or no? You're good.
I'm good.
Shameless, shameful,
The right amount.
moderate.
I'm a
Average
centrist.
amounts of shame.
I'm a centrist.
Excellent. Taylor Hines, I will introduce before asking him a ridiculous question. Maybe I won't even ask him this ridiculous question. He's an editor at Damage Magazine, our friends at Damage Magazine, and an associate teaching professor at the Honor College at Arizona State University. Hi, Taylor.
Hey, how are you guys doing?
Welcome. Great to have you. I'm going to pass on to George. George will take this far more seriously than me.
Well, I just wanted to mention that. So my wife, who was raised Catholic and I was raised Protestant, she had this joke that Catholics can do anything as long as they confess, and Protestants can do anything as long as they feel guilty about it. So I suppose I could say I was guilty since birth.
Yeah,
there we go.
Well, I think I'd fit more in the Protestant. Yeah, in the Protestant model there. But yeah, don't want to give too much away about my mental state. Anyway, yeah, I will take this more seriously and get us back on track after only 2 minutes. So,
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga. Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Today we're going to be discussing Taylor's excellent essay from the 4th issue of Damage, Fool Me Twice, which deals with questions of shame and guilt, along with Robert Eggers' Nosferatu, Frédéric Gross's philosophy of shame as well. There's a lot in there. We'll be unpicking this as we go through. And from the essay itself, the shamed retreat into themselves, but the guilty can take responsibility for their actions. So we'll come back to this and the difference between shame and guilt, and why one might be good and one might be not quite so good. So, but yeah, just to kind of give listeners a way into this, we were talking before recording about Nosferatu. Is it Robert Eggers' best film? Is it a great film, etc.? But what is your reading of this film, and why do you think it's a film about shame specifically, Taylor?
Yeah, so I don't think it's Eggers' best film, although I really enjoyed watching it. I think it's a lot of fun. But I do think shame is really at the core of what's happening in this movie. In some sense, it takes place very self-consciously at the kind of beginning of a new bourgeois society. And there's a lot of bourgeois sensibility and bourgeois shame kind of baked into the plot of the film. I think this is seen most obviously in the character of Ellen, who's ashamed of her fantasies about the vampire Orlok. But also in the character of Thomas, her husband, who is living with friends. He's ashamed of his debt and his inferior social status, and it's that shame that kind of compels him to go to Orlok and try and deal with him. And there's a scene in the film I can remember where he's sitting at the vampire's dinner table, and he's kind of too ashamed of poor social manners to escape. And so really, I would say throughout the film, it's shame that's kind of the lever which this vampire uses to compel other people to do as he wishes. And I would also argue that there's two different kinds of shame which appear in the film. The kind of emerging bourgeois culture embodied in Thomas, who's a clerk at like a bank or something, is contrasted pretty explicitly with a more traditional clan-based culture when Thomas meets the Roma people who live around the vampire's castle. And when they meet, they each have a kind of different type of shame. For Thomas, his shame is personal, individual. It's related to his kind of inferior social status. But for them, they're ashamed at his lack of regard for traditional customs. And it's actually these customs which allow them to protect themselves against the vampire's malign influence. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but part of my essay is about Gross's book, A Philosophy of Shame. And he has a line in that book where he says the bourgeois family is obsessed with three major avatars of shame. That's the adulterous woman, the gay son, and the masturbating child. And in some sense, all three of those things come together in Orlok's character. When Ellen is just a young girl, she has sexual dreams about Orlok. That's the masturbating child. When she grows up, she fantasizes about Orlok instead of her husband. That's the adulterous woman. And then when Thomas finally meets Orlok, there's a very sexual scene where Orlok sucks his blood, and that could be interpreted as the gay son. So I think shame is really at the root of Orlok's character, so much so that he really doesn't need to use his superpowers. He can just kind of use shame to compel people to do what he wants.
Interesting. And sorry, I should have said, like, spoiler alert for any listeners who haven't seen the film or haven't read Dracula or haven't seen the 1922 version or haven't seen the Herzog version.
There's a vampire in this thing? What?
Yeah, I guess it's a story that's probably been told quite a few times, but yeah, the way that Eggers puts that kind of spin on it, and I think that kind of the three avatars of shame in the bourgeois family is a really interesting idea. And as you said, we'll get on to Gross's book, but you also mentioned another kind of literary case of the use of shame, and this is in the Rape of Lucretia. Do you think it's a coincidence that in both cases it's the woman who's feeling the shame? What does this tell us about what the bourgeois family needs for its smooth operation? I mean, if you would even agree that the Rape of Lucretia has anything to say about the bourgeois family, maybe it's a bit pre-bourgeois, maybe it fits into the Klein, as you were saying before, maybe it's a different entirely. Anyway, that's it. Like, however many questions in one, pick the most interesting one and feel free to answer that.
Yeah, I think it's definitely not a coincidence that in both cases it's women who are shamed. I think maybe though it's for different reasons. In both cases, there's kind of a lesson about how women need to conform to a certain ideal in order for society to function smoothly. Basically, the shame in both cases is the shame of some kind of unfaithfulness. For Lucretia, it's kind of a faithfulness and productive domesticity, which is the ideal she's held to. And for Ellen in Nosferatu, it's the faithfulness in her fantasy life. And in both cases, I would say it's the women who are motivated by shame to make the ultimate sacrifice, both in a manner of speaking, commit suicide in each text as a way of repairing the shame they have inadvertently brought to their family. And so I think that the social imperative is pretty clear here. It's kind of, women stay in your place or there may be deadly consequences. But I think more generally, in any society where there's like a gendered division between civil life and domestic life, the law or justice is used to police the men, and shame is what polices the women. So I think, yeah, the short answer is no. I don't think it's a coincidence. And to bring it back to the bourgeois family, I think in some sense, much has been written about how under capitalism, individuals are turned into commodities, or workers are turned into commodities. And so in some sense, the imperative is to be fungible, like a fungible person. And so the shame is to be abnormal, to be a defective commodity. And so while I do think it's not a coincidence that it's women in both cases, more generally, shame is used to keep everybody in line to perhaps a lesser degree.
Yeah, no, I think that's a kind of an interesting starting point because, and just for listeners who don't know the story of the Rape of Lucretia, and correct me if I get any of this wrong, but the Tarquin is a kind of proto incel?
Yeah, this is my bit. he was the first manosphere incel who's like, oh, women are all sluts, and then he finds out that Lucretia won't sleep with him, and is like, oh, what a bitch! I hate women, So.
And then he takes it several
It takes
steps
it a bit
too
too
far,
far. Yeah.
and rapes her, and then she then commits suicide. But I guess the you know, obviously and Shakespeare has a poem on this, and there's an opera. There's a number of different retellings of this, but I guess in both cases it does seem like shame is a kind of mechanism of social control. It's a way to get people to conform, to behave, to kind of live up to certain required stereotypes. And I guess all of this is kind of by way of introduction, because the central thing that the essay deals with, or one of the central things, is partly through a review of Gross's philosophy of shame, a revolutionary emotion, which clearly is going against this. And I just think it's a kind of something to set up there, because I guess that's my starting point as well. Shame doesn't seem to be revolutionary. It seems to be reactionary. It seems to be kind of, you could say in more positive terms, it's civilizing. Like if you break the rules, you feel shame, so you kind of conform, and that's what civilization needs. But it seems like that kind of shame of transgression is not, it's not a revolutionary emotion, is it? But yeah, why could somebody make the argument that it might be? Because it just seems like the intuitive starting point is it's something which keeps people in line more.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think partly what this might be pointing to is that there are a few, in my reading at least, maybe minor contradictions in the book. So just a little bit of background. A Philosophy of Shame is a series of essays all relating to the central theme of shame and its history and its philosophy, essays from Frédéric Gros that have recently been published by Verso, I think just a couple months ago. And it was quite a fun read for me. There's bits from Rousseau, Corneille, Plato, Confucius, and they all have it brings together a lot of different perspectives on what the emotion of shame is, or the history of shame is. And by and large, most would understand it, and I think it's most naturally understood as a restraining conformist influence. But I think Gross does show that in certain circumstances, shame can be both a restraining influence and also a compelling influence. For instance, shame or the fear of shame could compel someone to pursue revenge or glory, success, wealth, and so on. And so, in that sense, it's a compelling influence, but compelling someone to try and maintain a certain status quo or fulfill a certain social expectation. And this is where I'll get into this later, but I have my doubts about whether shame can really be a revolutionary emotion, because when it does compel someone, it often compels them to fit into expectations of their society. I think one example, like an early example that Gross gives of how shame can be, I say, a provoking influence, is with, say, someone like Socrates, who goes around trying to shame people of their knowledge. So he's, famously proud of his ignorance, and then tries to get people to feel ashamed of what they think they know. And in this case, it's shame that's used to kind of provoke people out of their rut, so to speak. Whether that's actually revolutionary or not, I'm not so sure.
Yeah, I guess my skepticism still remains, because it does seem like it. I guess it could potentially change your perspective about your own knowledge or lack thereof. But is that revolutionary? Don't you need some kind of people acting in concert? And shame seems to be an individuating or kind of isolating emotion, perhaps. I mean, I do take your point about the avoidance of shame. That could be compelling, provoking. You try to maintain some honor. But I guess one thing that listeners might be wondering at this point, we trailed this as talking about guilt and shame. What's the difference here? Because this does come out of Gross's work, and what is the difference between the two, or how historically might this have changed?
Yeah, so I think that maybe the best way to see this contradiction, which is how can shame, which is a restraining influence, be interpreted as revolutionary? I think the way to understand this is through a kind of history that Gross lays out, which kind of tracks the difference between guilt and shame. And so he begins by describing like a traditional or a clan society in which shame is kind of the glue that keeps everything together. Um, and he defines shame in a traditional or clan society is having 4 defining qualities. It's objective, it's tangible, it's collective, and it's reversible. So an example being like in the Middle Ages, honor and the shame of dishonor was felt to be so tangible that people's honor was actually offered up as a kind of collateral or credit when borrowing money, for instance. And if someone was shamed, say, like an example that Gros gives is the character of Diego in Le Cid. Le Cid's father, who is shamed by a rival and then asks his son, Le Cid, to avenge his honor. In some sense, this means that shame is reversible in the sense that through revenge, it can be undone. But as Gros goes on to argue, all of this changes in bourgeois society. Instead, the state supplants this function, right? There are laws and credit scores and police and so on, which take over the role of shame, the social role of shame. And instead, shame just becomes kind of a feeling instead of something concrete. Whereas guilt takes the place of what shame once was. The idea being like someone who breaks the rules is now guilty, and that guilt is adjudicated by the state, whereas shame just becomes something an individual feels on their own, a kind of emotion. And so, like an example, and this comes from the book, Descartes writes that shame is a kind of sadness based on self-love, which comes from expecting to be blamed or being anxiously aware that one may be blamed. So this is a major reversal, we might argue, between traditional society and bourgeois society, which is that shame is no longer concrete, it's individualized, and instead it's guilt, which is the concrete thing, and is sort of encoded socially. But then where this continues to develop in Gross's work, and this is where I kind of start to have my doubts, is that Gross wants to argue that this reversal has continued and now shame is again concrete and real. He gives an example like social media where online shaming can give tangible real world effects, even if they're not reversible. So the idea being that through technology like social media, shame has again become a concrete, real thing. And I think the hope is that now that shame is real again, maybe we can use it like in traditional society to create social change. This is where I kind of disagree. I mean, I think in my opinion, it's just not true that shame is real in the way it used to be in clan society, for the simple reason that like you can log out of your account, as difficult as that may feel. You can't log out of your clan. You know what I mean? It's necessary for every part of life, whereas your Twitter account is just not. And so I still think we're pretty firmly trapped in the era of shame being an individual emotion rather than a concrete social construct.
So I had just a thing about kind of online and online shame, because I think a lot of the discussion, from what I gathered about this book, and I also read a review of it by Nina Power, and the kind of discussions around these issues, and a lot of it seems to assume that, that online, that there's this new politics of shame, right? This postmodern politics of shame, of shouting people down, cancel culture, etc. And I'm not so convinced that that is real. Not that I'm not saying that cancel culture isn't real, but that the role of shame there is a bit ambiguous, I think, because basically they're in a kind of the argument, I think, as far as I understand it goes, shame's back because social media creates like this high visibility society, right? And you need to kind of have visibility and imagine yourself visible to others to feel shame. If you don't feel, visible and you think you've done something wrong, you might feel guilty, but I don't think you feel shame unless you're imagining yourself through the eyes of others. And of course, social media provides you with a hell of a lot of that, a lot of raw material to imagine yourself through the eyes of others. But in an attention economy, being wrong has become an asset. Like you see people posting stuff that's clearly wrong, that they're aware is wrong, and if they're challenged on it, they can either ignore it and feel like, well, actually, but I did my job because it drove engagement, or even be self-conscious about it and be, kind of nakedly say, yeah, well, I don't see how many followers you have. Look, I have 40,000 and you only have 10,000. So like, obviously my wrongness is working, right? And so, the currency is clicks, it's attention, it's money, whatever. It's something quantifiable, and in such a context, people act shamelessly. That's a shameless way to act, and it seems to me that like shame doesn't really have the hold that that even Gros seems to purport for it to have online.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think the only people upon which it does have a hold are the people who haven't adopted this new online culture, who are still in the kind of standard mode of how should I say, worrying about what the people close to them think about them. I'm just reminded of like Rousseau, who he kind of thought the major disaster of society was the fact that it forces us all to reconsider ourselves from the perspective of other people. And I think somewhere like online, there's a part of this at work, but there's also just the fact that the online world is just kind of a parallel reality that just doesn't matter in the same way that actual life does. And so I completely agree that there's currency in acting shamelessly, there's currency in being wrong, there's currency in just making people mad, whether you're right or wrong. And the idea that somehow we could turn this type of shame or shamelessness into a viable politics just seems untenable, I guess, in my opinion.
What do you think the politics of shame would look like for Gross? I mean, is this essentially just kind of cancel culture but good? I mean, because I'm trying to be as sympathetic as I can to the kind of idea that shame today could be concrete and could be used for social change, but it seems like I'm might just be stuck in a kind of caricature, like or seeing cancel culture in a quite caricatured way, where it's just there doesn't seem to be much scope for positive social change in that kind of model of politics. It seems to be much more about enforcing conformity. So I mean, does Gross talk about this in the book, like how it's a revolutionary emotion, here's what you would practically do to kind of start to see this revolutionary politics?
But he does to an extent, and I think the way you summed it up is actually quite good, which is it's cancel culture, but good. And I should say, I think that's a good way of describing what Gross has in mind, at least in my reading. So I just pulled up a quick quote here from the book where he imagines the following. He says, take the white, educated, middle-class man in good health and a permanent job who owns his house, is comfortably off, orders takeaway with a tip, of course, for the delivery man, and is nice to his cleaning lady. That guy is not ashamed. He does not want to be ashamed or allow his clear conscience to be ruffled. And I think the idea here is that Gross imagines that someone in this position would be shamed into breaking out of their comfortable life and maybe marching or demonstrating, or at the very least, feeling shame as a kind of token solidarity with people who are less well off than he is. And in fact, I even think Gross kind of mentions this. He draws the analogy of shame to like union dues for everybody, which I really kind of thought was a little wild. But again, another quote I would just read here is he says, shame ought to be the price to pay, the minimum in union dues that they should be expected to cough up for the person born into privilege whose history is marked by slavery, genocides, colonial empires, discrimination against women, and the exploitation of the most vulnerable. So I do think, back to my quick joke about Protestants being able to do anything as long as they feel guilty, this kind of seems like an example of that, where the idea is, oh, we have privilege, we're more comfortable than the most destitute, so we can use shame as a way to kind of atone for that, while I would argue not really changing a whole lot.
I like I'm troubled by that because I just feel like that's a politics which feels desperate. Like it feels lost, right? I'm sympathetic to it in the sense that you see people behaving shamelessly, right? In ways which they profit from things, and you think, well, you should at least have some concern. But I'm well aware that concern mongering is part of the problem of politics today, particularly in the attention economy, where you say you must care about this, and you have so many demands placed upon you to care about something that the response of a lot of people is like cynicism, whatever. Or they're only out for their own thing, right? So you have some NGO, some charity coming asking you to care about this thing, and you're like, but I know your game. You're asking me to care about starving children in Africa, to take the cliche, now kind of outdated claim to care, kind of humanitarian concern. And it's like, well, but you just want more people to sign up to sustain your NGO job, and et cetera, to keep the show on the road. There's nothing really behind it. So it's just, cynical. And so, from my understanding, I mean, at least what you convey of Gros' book through your review, it's that, there might be some righteous indignation at social injustice, which causes you shame. And you can feel, and I agree with that. I mean, and I think that, should be mobilizing, but the reality is that it isn't, because we don't feel that there's ways to change things. And so it's much better to brush off any feelings of shame at our society, shame at the injustice, etc., than, without any avenue to drive that forward. So it seems to me like he's just recapitulating the impasse of politics that we're in now, rather than providing a solution to it.
Yeah, I would completely agree. It's just so easy for the existing apparatuses of control to co-opt our shame into further clicks or likes or what have you, that there just doesn't seem to be any productive or viable way for shame to be channeled into anything beyond, online outrage, or maybe a donation to an NGO or something like that. And so I agree. It does feel a little bit like a politics of desperation, where you're furiously groping around for something to break people out of this morass, and you latch on to shame. But unfortunately, I think that's just another part of what makes it all function.
Hello friends, you've reached the end of a sample from an episode only available to subscribers. We put out 2 episodes a month for free. For access to the rest in its entirety, please join us at patreon.com/Bungacast. For $7 a month, subscribers receive original, exclusive episodes with the entirety of the Bungacast cast. That's George Hoare, myself, Alex Hochuli, and our contributing editors, Philip Cunliffe, Amber Lee Frost, Catherine Liu, Lee Jones, Alex Gurevich, and Lee Phillips. We've got extended interviews with guests, episodes on current affairs, and original episodes on theory, history, and culture, so as to understand the crises of our times. We also have the Bungacast Reading Club, where Phil, George, and myself present the key books and essays necessary for understanding the world today, how we got here, and where we might be going. Subscribers also get a digital subscription to Damage magazine, with whom we're partnered, and you can find all this info at patreon.com/Bungacast. We do hope you'll join us. These are turbulent times, and ideologically confused ones as well. What we try to do is find political clarity, to move beyond the decadent age of Bunga Bunga.